Gildan Media, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Inglorious Years, The Collapse of the Industrial Order and the Rise of Digital Society, by Danielle Cohen. Translated by Jane Marie Todd. Narrated by Liam Gerrard. Preface to the English edition. In this book, I describe the transformation of economic structures and political thinking that has swept the world over the last 50 years, from the 60s to the present. The collapse of the old industrial society in favour of a digital society still in the making forms the heart of this account. By tragic coincidence, as the English language edition of this book was being prepared, the world was battered by a crisis unique in recent history, a pandemic, COVID-19. In a totally unpredictable manner, it served as a catalyst for a burgeoning of digital society whose underlying logic, unexpectedly, it allows us to understand. Because of the virus, society has suddenly become fearful of face-to-face contact. All of us are trying to protect ourselves from the risk of infection others may be carrying. Restaurants, cafes, and concert halls, essential sites where urban civilization can flourish, were closed. Life withdrew to the family cell, and the burden of stress and frustration followed. During the lockdown, every possible step was taken to allow people to work online easily, to purchase goods without having to physically enter a store, to entertain themselves without venturing out to a theatre or concert hall. As it happens, the key feature of what can be called digital capitalism is precisely to reduce physical interactions, to dispense with the need for people to meet face-to-face. Under the assault of the health crisis, fine-tuning digital capitalism has come into the spotlight, increasing its efficiency by dispensing with the need to meet in person. Many activities have been rendered virtual. In medicine, for example, many consultations are now conducted remotely. The big winners in the crisis were Amazon, Apple, and Netflix, whose control of the market exploded during the lockdown. The virus arrived at just the right time for the dominant players in digital industries, who were able to conduct a full-scale experiment on the virtual world's assimilation of the physical world. Back in 1948, the French economist Jean Forestier published an analysis of long-term economic transformations which provides us with an essential key for understanding the change underway. Forestier announced that the great hope of the 20th century was the transition from an industrial society to a service society. Human beings, he explained, had worked the earth for millennia, and had worked materials for the last 2 centuries. In the service society, whose rise Forestier was announcing, their work would be other human beings. His great hope was that humankind would finally become humanized in a social world, where everyone would look after everyone else, as educator, caregiver, or personal coach. Forestier nevertheless pointed out a problem which would have major repercussions. This service economy would produce much slower growth. If the commodity I sell is the time I spend with others, growth is by definition limited by the time available. This is known to economists as Baumol's cost disease, a term coined by William Baumol and William Bowen. Growth is necessarily kept in check when one has to meet in person, whether to examine the bodies of patients or attend a play, and the essence of capitalism, always and everywhere, is to seek the systematic reduction of costs. It took a long time to find the solution to Baumol and Forestier's problem, but it is now clear. One has only to convert the humans we are, beings of flesh and spirit, into data sets, bits of information about our temperatures or our desires, so that we may become part of the web, where we can be managed by algorithms. Freed from the imperative of encounters in the flesh, growth once again becomes possible, online. During the spring of 2020, Paris, New York, London, and Milan stopped working. Health concerns became imperative, and was compared ironically by some to May '68, when the economy also suddenly came to a halt in opposition to the assembly line work and mindlessness of industrial society. The comparison between the COVID-19 pandemic and the 60s is obviously comical. Back then, people threw themselves into the feverish pleasure of political demonstrations. Presently, COVID has us at home in lockdown, in a kind of internal exile. With the digitization of the world, the great hope that society would have finally been humanized is receding into the distance. In a strange inversion of May 68 values, it has been those on the right, supporters of Trump, who have waged the war against the lockdown in the name of freedom. The fact that a large number of society's loudest forces now bend towards the radical right is telling of the U-turn that our societies are engaged in. Yet the criticisms voiced by the young hippies in California and the leftists in Paris have also found echoes in present-day society, be it with radical groups such as Extinction Rebellion in the name of ecology, or Black Lives Matter in favour of civil rights. The polarisation of politics, the criticism of the contemporary world, are becoming as sharp as they were in the 60s, when they were directed against industrial society. History is coming full circle. Introduction. "The times they are a-changin'," sang Bob Dylan in 1964, and changed they have, but not in the way expected. Strange shifts have occurred, taking us from one world to another, totally alien from the one that brought it into existence. Hope for a bright future has given way to nostalgia for an idealized past. Populism has replaced leftism as the voice of protest. The enormous difficulty young people experience in imagining the future, their confinement to a kind of perpetual present, are the symptoms of traumas accumulated over the last half-century. The long, aimless wandering of the advanced societies has been the expression of a profound but undefinable discontent. Like an orphan who has inherited a fortune and who spends it in the futile hope of getting her parents back, post-industrial society has sought with all its might, but in vain, to reconnect with the old world's promises of progress. As if by the effect of a genetic mutation, a new online species, all surface without interiority, closer to hunter-gatherers than to farmers, has emerged. Homo digitalis, whose algorithmic life will decide the future of civilization. To understand the rage and frustrations that brought this Homo digitalis into being, to grasp also the carefree attitude and joie de vivre that have mingled with them, such are the goals to pursue if one wants to protect the humanistic values that are part of our heritage, before they are once again betrayed. 50 years ago, when this story began, the events that took place in Paris in May 68 ignited the imagination of its time in a way reminiscent of the French Revolution and its abolition of the Ancien Regime. For the young people who marched in the Latin Quarter, at issue was nothing less than to bring down bourgeois society. But, as Marx said, when history repeats itself, it often does so as farce. May 68 was a joyous celebration. No one was guillotined. It was no longer a question of demanding bread, but of taking boundless pleasure in an overabundance of riches. In Paris, as in San Francisco and Berlin, a new generation thought it could create a new world, rid of the monotony of assembly line work and material concerns, and composed of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Unfortunately, economic growth stalled in the mid-70s. A long period of stagnation began, shattering the aspirations of the 60s. The enthusiasm of a generation that had believed it possible to break free from the biblical curse of toil was shattered. This would be the first trauma of the past half-century. The economic crisis soon offered the adversaries of 60s radicalism the opportunity for revenge. The Irishman Edmund Burke had blamed the French Revolution for triggering discord and vice and making the younger generations lose their reason and virtue. The neo-conservatives, having returned in force in the early 80s, took up the same refrain. So the protesters of May 68 wanted to forbid forbidding. They were wrong. The existence of every society relies on rules and prohibitions. They wanted to demand the impossible. They had forgotten that the human condition is tragic. According to the critics of May 68, the slide toward apathy, hedonism, and moral chaos had to be arrested as soon as possible. In the eyes of those who voted for Ronald Reagan, his election exemplified the revenge of the reality principle over the pleasure principle. He was the standard-bearer of a moral as well as an economic revolution. Yet, he would lend his support to an illusion just as naive as that of the protesters, that of thinking that capitalism can regulate itself through a restored moral imperative. On the contrary, the world would witness the triumph of greed, his election being followed by an utterly indecent explosion of wealth inequality. The conservative revolution's betrayal would be the second great disillusionment of our time. The transition from the 60s to the 80s might have been only an ordinary swing of the pendulum of human desire, from the wish for personal emancipation to the equally persistent need to return home to the warmth and coziness of one's own tradition. A profoundly warped form of that opposition emerged over the last half-century. The joyous protest against the established order slid into competitive individualism, while the praise of tradition also underwent a transformation, veering toward the rejection of the traditions of others, toward xenophobia. In place of a noble confrontation between emancipation and tradition, we have witnessed a great schism between the winners, autonomous, emancipated from conventions, and the losers, seeking in tradition a protection it was unable to offer. The rise of populism is the expression of that crisis. After an interminable odyssey in which the lower classes lost the frames of reference that industrial society had offered them, they are revolting against the left, which is accused of moral laxity, and against the right, guilty of thinking only of enriching themselves. The migration of the working classes to the populist parties sounds the death knell of the hopes of a generation that had written on the walls of its university buildings, "The working class will take the banner of revolt from the students' fragile hands." This is the third great lost illusion. How are we to understand this series of crises and ruptures? What is the hidden pain of which this period was the expression? The answer lies in a decisive factor: the collapse of a civilization, that of the industrial world, and the enormous difficulty advanced societies have had in finding a successor to it. The idea of a post-industrial society, proposed to characterize our era, has catalyzed every sort of misunderstanding. The left interpreted it as the harbinger of the end of capitalism, the right as a return to its founding value, hard work. Both were wrong. It is only in recent years that the veil has been lifted to reveal its true meaning. To understand the nature of the disillusionments that the end of the industrial world has brought about, we must reread Jean Forasti's Great Hope of the 20th Century, a fundamental work published in 1948. The hope of the new era, according to that major economist, was that human beings, having worked the soil in agrarian societies, then materials in industrial society, would now concern themselves with other human beings, in a society where work time would be dedicated to people rather than objects, in the fields of health, education, or leisure activities. It is that hope for a more human economy that has been betrayed. Forasti underestimated the importance of one essential point: the irresistible need for growth in modern societies. He clearly acknowledged that a service society in which Mr. X takes care of Ms. Y cannot grow. If the value of service that you sell is the time that you spend with your customer, student or patient, growth must stall. Forasti did not think it would be a problem, but it did. The desire for growth has remained insatiable, however rich the advanced economies have become. It is possible, of course, to work more to earn more, as a former president of France urged, but it would never be possible thereby to double one's earnings every 15 years, the situation in the industrial world of the 50s and 60s. To enable an increase in purchasing power, economies of scale must be found that allow a service provider to take on a growing number of clients, like an actor who increases the size of his audience by moving from theatre to television. After a great deal of trial and error, it seems that post-industrial society has found a way to define and name itself. Digital society. To achieve efficiency, everyone must enter the cybernetic world like a pill into a body, becoming a bit of data that can be processed by another bit of data. Software, artificial intelligence, will be able to take care of an unlimited number of clients, treat them, advise them, entertain them, provided they have been digitized beforehand. The prophetic film Her presents software with the capacity for emotion, whose bewitching voice is that of the actress Scarlett Johansson, in love with several million people at once. Such is the promise announced by Homo Digitalis, that of a world emancipated from the limits of the human body. The entire question is obviously whether the cure will be worse than the disease. Are robots going to replace humans and increase poverty? Will assembly line work give way to efficiency protocols for the mind via Facebook and Netflix? Through an extraordinary curvature of historical time, the old questions of the industrial world are arising in the heart of the world that replaced it. Do we have to pass through every stage of it once again, its moral bankruptcy and its financial crises? Can we do better? History is now being written, provided we do not err about its meaning. Part 1. Going Away, Coming Back. Chapter 1. Modern Mythologies. For those who are now 20, the 60s are as far away in space-time as the World War I was 50 years ago for their precursors. In both cases, the weight of the past is considerable. The young people reproached their parents for having forgotten the tragedies of history in the boring comfort of consumer society. The youth of today launch an accusation at their elders that it is the exact opposite. It is the precariousness of the world, economic insecurity, that is now the object of reproach against their forerunners. The critics of the counterculture of the 60s have accused the movement of being responsible for the contemporary world's sense of abandonment. The Woodstock crowd is said to have prepared the way for the rise of individualism and to have sown the seeds of economic liberalism. Thus, the San Francisco hippies and the young people who occupied the Odeon Theatre in Paris were working toward Wall Street's power grab? That is clearly completely idiotic. It was Reagan and Thatcher, the enemies of the 60s protests, who, 20 years later, would discover an incredibly successful formula, pushing an ultra-liberal agenda in economics under cover of achieving a moral restoration in the field of values. The 60s were far more a critique of the growing individualism of its time than its cause. Everywhere, whether in Berkeley, Paris, or Rome, young students expressed their anger against a society devoted to the cult of consumption. But for the economists who analyse that period, it looks like a true golden age. Growth was extraordinary, unemployment almost non-existent. As Jean-Pierre Le Goff says in his memoirs, progress seemed finally to be fulfilling its promises. It was no longer put off as a bright future that could only be achieved through further sacrifices and efforts. It was becoming concrete in the present through access to consumer goods and lifestyles that changed everyday life. The past seemed to be becoming obsolete. Under a veneer of opulence, however, a malaise was beginning to make itself felt. The newspaper Le Monde, in its edition of March 15, 1968, published a now famous article by Pierre Vincent-Ponty, which perfectly summed up the topa from which May 68 sought to wrest French society. When France gets bored, France, he explained, was at peace for the first time in a century. It had traded the heroic life for the comfort of bourgeois society, and it was bored. But Vincent-Ponty concluded, for a people, that may be what we call happiness. It was that very happiness, the daily grind of metro boulot dodo, subway, work, sleep, that the young rejected. At both ends, in both production and consumption, industrial society was reaching its limits. The world of production was that of assembly line work, Taylor's organization of labor. Frederick Winslow Taylor's Principles of Scientific Management, written in the early 20th century, remained the businessman's Bible. It brought the stopwatch onto the shop floor, timing the average duration of each task to reduce it to the minimum. Under Taylor's influence, workers saw their activities reduced to a single, endlessly repeated gesture. Taylorism excludes labourers from the production process of which they are supposed to be the agents. They are excluded from the work itself. All the conditions necessary to perform the task are taken out of their hands. They are excluded from the realm of knowledge. The worker is not there to think, and they are denied control of their time. The pace of work and their breaks is predetermined. One exclusion sums up all the others. The worker is alone at his station, forbidden to communicate with others. Taylor was not unaware of the human tragedies that his system would engender, but he also surely thought that the workers, becoming richer thanks to the new productivity, would enjoy the fruits of prosperity outside work. Henry Ford, creator of the Ford automobile, grasped this very quickly. To tie workers to the boring work of the assembly line, he understood that he had to pay them as well as possible. There is a time to weep and a time to laugh. It was this stark division at the root of the industrial world, work hard so as to be able to consume later, that became intolerable. Added to the fatigue of producing under dehumanizing conditions was an unexpected weariness with consumption itself. In 1957, Roland Barthes' cult book, Mythologies, had exposed with consummate humor consumer society's promise of achieving, under cover of emancipation, the petty bourgeois happiness of calculation and order. The First World Detergent Conference, held in Paris in 1954, had allowed him to comment with scathing glee on the success of the laundry soap Omo. To say that Omo cleans in depth is to assume that laundry is deep, which no one had previously thought, and this unquestionably results in exalting it, by establishing it as an object favourable to those obscure tendencies to enfold and caress which are found in any human body. Then, commenting on a new Citroën DS, the famous French luxury car, Barthes noticed that it marked a change in automobile mythology. Previously paeans to power, the automobile was becoming more homely, more attuned to this sublimation of the utensil which one also finds in the design of contemporary household equipment. The dashboard looks more like the working surface of a modern kitchen than the control room of a factory. The slim panes of matte, fluted metal, the small levers topped by a white ball, the very simple dials, the very discreetness of the nickelwork. All this signifies a kind of control exercised over motion, which is henceforth conceived as comfort rather than performance. For the sociologist Jean Baudrillard, inspired by Barthes, consumer society is pervaded by a fundamental tension. It wants comfort and heroism. It is torn between the passivity it entails and a social morality that, for the most part, remains that of action and sacrifice. The way to resolve that contradiction, according to Baudrillard, is to dramatize life through the media. The consumer's tranquility in front of his television must be presented as a feat wrested from the turpitudes of the outside world. The violence of that world must be shown as crudely as possible, to allow the observer to savour the tranquility being offered. Consumer society is experienced as a besieged Jerusalem, rich and threatened. That is its ideology. It is the ideology of the TV viewer relaxing in front of the horrors of the Vietnam War. 15 years after May 68, the American economist Albert Hirschman, reconsidering Baudrillard's analysis, added an essential corrective. In his eyes, the weariness of moderns in the face of consumer society must be understood as one of the consequences of prosperity. It is when the economic situation is good, when wealth exceeds expectations, that people believe they have had their fill of material riches. They then demand higher satisfactions. They want heroism, generosity. But prosperity is always relative. Whatever the level of wealth already achieved, the desire to consume, when it ceases to be satisfied, is quickly reignited. In periods of weak growth, the order of priorities is reversed. Crisis makes people selfish and leads them to turn inward. Depression can then be understood in both senses of the term, economic and psychological. Desire, according to Hirschman, runs counter to the economic cycle. It wants authenticity when growth is strong, and material wealth in periods of recession. This theory would allow him to interpret the 60s and to anticipate the conservative revolution of the 80s that would follow, when the demand for petty bourgeois comforts would return in force, prompted by an economic crisis. Writing in 1978, Hirschman did not know that the 60s marked much more than the culmination of a growth phase. A far more fundamental upheaval was taking place, the fall of industrial society. Against all expectations, the trumpets of Jericho blown in 1968 would bring down the walls of the old fortress. The protesters that year obviously had nothing to do with its fall. They were more aware of the fragility of industrial society than they were responsible for its collapse. A totally unprecedented cycle was beginning, marked through and through by a loss of meaning. It would take 50 years to unfold. Are young people bored? The celebration of the 50th anniversary of May 68 made it possible for the French to relive, in pictures and, as if in real time, that month of madness when France as a whole decided to stop working. Patrick Rotman gave a sober and precise account of May 68 for those who did not live through it. Strictly speaking, the Paris Spring began on May the 3rd, with the first significant day of student demonstrations, and ended on June the 30th, 1968, with the legislature elections and the French people's departure on summer vacation. Viewed in terms of a decade, May 68 was situated halfway between the end of the Algerian War and the oil crisis of 1973. Decolonization was in full swing. The image of America, yesterday the liberator of Europe, had profoundly deteriorated. American support for Latin American dictatorships effaced the heroism of the generation that had defeated Nazism. For young Americans themselves, the Vietnam War was the greatest abomination. Their loathing would extend beyond their country's borders. On February the 17th and 18th, 1968, a major demonstration against the war was being held in Berlin. Daniel Cohen-Bendit, Alain Krivine, Henri Weber, and several hundred French people attended. In Germany, the leader of the student protest was Rudi Dutschke, known as Rudy the Red. Born in East Germany, he rejected both capitalism and communism. Following a vicious press campaign, he was the victim of an attempted murder. 2 bullets to the head would leave him hovering between life and death for several days. In Paris, the spark ignited on March the 21st, when a Paris-Nanterre University student was accused of breaking the windows of the American Express office during a rally against the Vietnam War. The next day, the university's administrative buildings were occupied. The March the 22nd movement was born. On May the 2nd, Dean Grappin decided to close the campus after several classes were disrupted, including that of the historian René Raymond. The students left Paris-Nanterre for the Sorbonne, which would be closed in turn at the request of Dean Jean Roche. The May 68 movement was launched. The police violated the immunity of the university and intervened. A night of street protests followed in Paris on May the 3rd. The movement spread to the provinces. In Toulouse, Lille, Bordeaux, and Marseille, thousands of students protested against police repression. Events reached the boiling point on the night of May the 10th. The students occupied the Latin Quarter in response to occupation of the Sorbonne. Paving stones were torn from the streets. Under the paving stones, the beach would be another famous May slogan. Spontaneously, without planning, at 2 o'clock in the morning the police mounted an assault. Many would be wounded on both sides. The next day the trade unions called for a general strike to be held on May the 13th. 10 years earlier to the day, in Algeria, demonstrations had led to the fall of the government and had precipitated de Gaulle's return. 10 years. A century. The general must have thought. Working-class France joined the students. Work gradually came to a halt. In little more than a week, from May the 14th to the 25th, the number of strikers reached 10 million. The pro-China protesters brandished a banner that proclaimed, "The working class will take the banner of revolt from the students' fragile hands." On May the 22nd, Danny Cohn-Bendit was expelled for declaring that the French flag should be ripped up and only the red flag kept. On the 24th, the students mobilized around the famous slogan, "We are all German Jews." On May the 25th, Prime Minister Georges Pompidou organized the response of the authorities. At the Ministry of Labour, he opened negotiations with the unions. The Confédération Générale du Travail, CGT, General Labour Confederation, perhaps encouraged by Moscow through the French Communist Party, played the negotiation game. At dawn on May the 27th, as another demonstration was being planned for the Charléty Stadium, with the support of the union's rivals in the Confédération Française Démocratique du Travail, CFDT, French Democratic Federation of Labour, and supported by Pierre Mendès France, a former French Prime Minister who ended the French war in Vietnam, an agreement was hastily signed. Wages were increased by 7%, the minimum wage by 35%, and union shops were recognised. On May the 29th, de Gaulle vanished. He secretly met with General Massu, commander of the French forces in Germany. A photo published by Paris Match showed the president getting out of a helicopter, his face haggard, looking defeated. On May the 30th, however, he took back the initiative. At the urging of the Prime Minister, he announced the dissolution of the National Assembly. While several 100,000 demonstrators marched up the Champs-Élysées in his support, the novelist Andre Malraux in the lead. The strikes would last another 3 weeks.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?